Namaskar, madam.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this World Human Sciences and Management Conference 2021. This is Rudranarayan Das, Executive Director, Center for Adivasi Research and Development. Welcome you to this global intellectual platform. We are proud to announce that this conference is concluded. The conference is conducted along with Indian Institute of Management Sambalpur and Central University of Odisha Koraput and Ravenshaw University Cuttack. I welcome our speaker for today, Professor Svetlana B.S. Bodrunova, and participants across the globe through Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter Live, and who are here to listen Professor Bodrunova here. The broader theme of this conference is agnotological context, disciplinary practices of social sciences, and policy frames. On behalf of Center for Adivasi Research and Development, I extend my profound gratitude to our patrons, Professor Dr. Mahadev Jaiswal, Director, Indian Institute of Management, Professor Dr. Sharad Kumar Palita, Vice Chancellor, Central University of Odisha, and Professor Dr. Sanjay Kumar Nayak, Vice Chancellor, Ravenshaw University, Cuttack. The convener of this largest virtual conference, eminent Indian historian, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, and eminent policy activist, writer, and philanthropist, Mr. Charudat Panigrahiji. The main outcome of this conference is to come up with a national and international framework for education system in future. The crux of this conference will be the use of digital technologies such as artificial intelligence, augmented reality, and virtual reality that is being increasingly adopted after the outbreak of COVID pandemic. We hope this conference would help students, faculties, researchers, and all to expand their mental horizon and help the education system to adopt the best. Ladies and gentlemen, this Center for Adivasi Research and Development is a leading research-oriented institution promoting ethnographic, empirical, and evidence-based research for engaging and addressing the challenges that 21st century globe is facing today. The prime agenda of this institution is to come up with potential policy solutions for social change while believing in the idea of 3D. It stands for debate, dialogue, and discussion, and with expertise, experiencing, and education, E3. The institution focus on marginalized communities and work for their livelihood to protect the nature, culture, language, and identity in particular. The age of modernity has witnessed that change is the only constant phenomenon for the societal purpose to enhance knowledge. Our information work for them is methodological and avoid paradoxically framework which neglected so many centuries from theory to become practice. Center for Adivasi Research and Development sincerely believes in the concept of social marketing, which is seriously looking for non-profit marketing and build new social entrepreneurship for check and balance mechanism to glorify generations to come. Center for Adivasi Research and Development serve with the holistic approach of critical thinking in education to fill the gaps to plan accordingly for the voiceless communities. Ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends, faculties, and researchers, today, our speaker is one of the great minds of the world. He's a communication expert from Russia, St. Petersburg University. He's none other than Professor Svetlana S. Bodrunova. Professor Bodrunova will deliver her talk on cumulative deliberation, a closer look to life, way of assessing network discussion. To introduce Professor Bodrunova, I would like to invite Dr. Nupur Patnaik. Please, Dr. Nupur Patnaik.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rudra. Am I audible clearly?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, a very good evening to all the audience. Good evening, Svetlana ma'am. Svetlana S. Bodrunova is a habilitated doctor of political science and professor at the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, St. Petersburg State University, Russia. She had led 6 research projects, published 4 authored edited volumes, and 100 plus chapters and papers in Russian and English, including those in journalism, social media, society, International Journal of Communication, Media and Communication, Journalism Practice. Her research interests include Russian and European journalism, media and politics, social media, ethnicity and communication. Svetlana ma'am leads the Center for International Media Research in her university. Since 2013, she has been the program chair of the International Conference, Comparative Media Studies in Today's World. In 2014 to 18, she has been the co-director of Global Communication and International Journalism, a double degree master program with Freie Universität Berlin, Germany, and the only double degree program in communication in Russia. She is the only 2 times recipient of the National Association of Mass Media Researchers Award for Best Academic Publication. And many more are there for Svetlana ma'am. So Professor Svetlana will be delivering her talk on cumulative deliberation, a closer to life way of assessing network discussion. So thank you, ma'am. We are eagerly waiting to listen to you, and we are privileged to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nubri Patnaik. I would like to invite Professor Loknath Mishra for a welcome remarks from Mizoram Central University. Sir, your audio is not.
Sir, the director card, Professor from Mizoram Central University, which is located in. Hello.
Yes, sir. Please continue.
Okay. Thank you, all of you, and let me welcome from on behalf of Mizoram Central University and Faculty Development Center to our esteemed speaker for this session. So I welcome all of you once again, and already ma'am has already introduced this about the biodata and all this about the speaker, so no need to speak again. So I from my sides, I welcome once again to all of you. Thank you. Hello.
Yes, please, madam. Now you should initiate your talk. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Mishra.
Good evening, dear colleagues, and thank you so much for this invitation. I'm honored and delighted to be with this audience. And yes, today I will talk on cumulative deliberation as a concept that my laboratory and myself, my research center and myself have been developing for a certain period of time already. If you don't mind, I will share my screen. Yes, just a moment. And hope you see it now. So my talk will be about cumulative deliberation. So we will speak about deliberation as a concept. So and a public sphere as a place where deliberation happens. So the idea of rational deliberation-based public sphere has appeared over 100 years ago at least. However, we know that today the sort of greatest living scholar who has been developing this idea has been Jürgen Habermas from Germany. He has been speaking about how the public spaces developed in Europe and beyond in terms of people's decision-making and people coming to solid decisions within a given society. So he was finding the ways for peaceful negotiation on decisions, and decisions which would be shared by the majority or by all the participants were the goal of such discussions. He considers public discussions of such sort, public discussions that are deliberative, a key element of today's democracies. So democratically efficient public communication that leads to decision-making and aims at comprehensive evaluation of alternatives for this decision-making can be called deliberation. Of course, this concept is highly normative because it describes a process as it has to be, as it must be, not as it is in real life, because in real life we only see some elements of such a process. So what he demands from the public sphere as a notion, so to say, as a concept, is that the public sphere and the process of deliberation, the process of public discussion on decisions and on choice of alternatives must be rational. It means that it has to be freed from most emotions, freed from personal motives, and should be based on the logic that is coming to the point where everyone agrees. It has to be rational, then it has to be inclusive, because the more people you include or the more viewpoints you include, the closer to balance consensus would be. This discussion should be around as if you were sitting, everyone has a chance. Then the overall goal of this discussion is that it is consensus seeking. So rational, inclusive, round by round public discussion, which is aiming at finding consensus, might be called deliberation. Of course, again, this is a highly normative concept. The thinking about it has emerged gradually. It was not a simple idea that came to Habermas's mind. Of course, it has been based on a lot of reading that was had been written much before Jürgen Habermas, and he came to this idea, actually to the idea of public sphere, nearly occidentally, because it was his translators, his interpreters, that actually coined the term public sphere in English. Because when Habermas started his work, it was about Öffentlichkeit in Germany. Öffentlichkeit meant not only the society, but also the status of being public, as contrary to being private. So when Habermas was writing one of his most popular, one of his most famous books on structural transformation of the public sphere, he actually wrote about Strukturwandel der Öffentlichkeit, which means structural changes in the status of publicity. So gradually, when his book was translated in English, the translators didn't find a better metaphor or better way of translating Öffentlichkeit, because the word publicity already meant something different from like the status of being public. They used this spatial metaphor of the sphere, maybe taking from Vernadsky, a Russian scholar of the first part of the 20th century who coined the term noosphere, the sphere of mind that was sort of as big as the biosphere around the world, around the planet. So Öffentlichkeit became a spatial metaphor, public sphere. And Habermas liked it. And he started to use this to think about how and where people come to decisions. So from Öffentlichkeit, he moved to public sphere. He also changed his thinking in terms of how people get to a common decision and where exactly it happens and how public sphere actually looks. He was first speaking of life world as sort of a horizon where all the deliberative practices take place. However, later, other scholars also started to speak about arenas where exactly the discussion takes place. And those arenas, again, became sort of a, you know, a soil for Habermas's new thinking. So he was sort of coming to more concrete details of how deliberation takes place. And also, he was highly critical towards his own normative concept, because he first said that institutions were responsible for how deliberation process takes place in the society or in any given society. So he first spoke about strategic narratives, about how not only groups of people, but mostly institutions create narratives that take part in deliberation. However, after reading François Rabelais from France and Mikhail Bakhtin from Russia, he claimed that he had to rethink the role of an individual inside the public deliberation. The role of citizens became much more evident to him and much more important within his conceptualization of the public sphere. And we will see how the concept of an individual gradually rises inside the thinking about the public sphere. Of course, these demands that Habermas has posed to public communication were quite high. He was trying to find sort of a third way between the Western individualism and a community way of finding a common decision. And he said that rationality, the ratio, was something that sort of could unite individual interests and a community goal-seeking, so to say, community good-seeking deliberation aims. So he was trying to save this communitary project that was broken when the Soviet Union fell and when a lot of socialist thinking has failed. So he was trying to find this common way for people to decide upon decisions without individual interests getting into this process too much. And this is why when he realized how important and even too important institutions were within this process, he started to speak about refeudalization, so recapturing of the public discourse by particular institutions, including media. Quite fast, quite quickly, the scholars, including Habermas himself, realized how far this thinking was from reality, actually, because this idea of rational, inclusive, peaceful, non-emotional public deliberation and the public sphere where it all happens clearly quite quickly seemed a lost ideal. Before the advent of transnational social networking in the 90s, in the years 2000, the critique of the Habermasian concept of the public sphere and the Habermasian concept of the norm for such public sphere and this deliberative process based on communicative action as a sort of as a deed as something that people do rather than just say. There were a lot of criticism which were based on several crucial points. First of all, a lot of people said people were irrational. You cannot sort of devoid individuals from their emotionality, from their interest, from their fears, from their experience. This all has to be inside public communication. Of course, within the boundaries of law, without hate speech, without national hatred or international hatred and so on. However, how can you sort of deprive the people of their natural features? Is that sort of, is it fair? Is it just? So shall we do that indeed? What would be the normativity if we think that actually being emotional is natural? Then a lot of feminist scholarship like Nancy Fraser or Chantal Mouffe, who was more leftist than feminist, especially women critics, actually said that what Habermas meant by consensus was not a consensus of equals, but a freezing, sort of a moment of freezing of hegemony. For example, of male dominant communities, of white males over 40 who are rich and who rule the world, so to say. So a lot of communities deprived of such voice were at stake in public deliberation. So public deliberation had to be much more equal than it was in reality. And public spheres that were not that equal became oppressive towards the people and even the communities, towards the whole communities or whole classes, or even, even females against males, or people who come like immigrants to the host population. For example, such public spheres based on the consensus of the majority, for example, or even on the consensus of rich minority, was really oppressive, rather than seeking equality, rather than seeking balanced decision, balanced for everyone. So the idea of counterspheres appeared, and these counterspheres based on culture, like subcultures, for example, based on cultural traits, based on perceptions, based on emotions, based on memory, and so on and so forth, have started to appear. And a lot of scholars have actually studied this and marked how counter-public spheres were quite weak in challenging the dominant public sphere and the dominant discourse. They were quite weak in uniting against the dominant public sphere, the hegemonic public sphere. And also they couldn't find, one of the reasons for their weakness was that they couldn't speak to each other, because they had different sort of, different discourses inside. They were discursively very different. So they couldn't find a common language. And this is why they were scattered around, and they couldn't find the common language and the common purpose of challenging the hegemony of the dominant public spheres. Also, public arenas as spaces for communication were not that inclusive, For example, one of my experiences, when I was studied one of the discussions on Twitter, we realized, my colleagues and I, we have realized that actually the discussion was not shaped the way that we expected, only because the immigrants who were part of the conflict in one of the Moscow districts were just not on Twitter, because they didn't have smartphones at that moment. It was 2013, and those communities just didn't have smartphones with access to Twitter. They just had button phones. And on Twitter, the people who were against immigrants quite well coordinated their action. And immigrants couldn't do anything about it. They just didn't know about this coordination. So chances in deliberative practices are never equal. And this has to do not only with platform affordances or access to platforms, but also with culture, with how people consume media, with age, for example, because a lot of people of older age cannot consume smartphones or couldn't consume smartphones 10 years ago, say. So this has become a whole big issue in public deliberation studies, because irrationality, non-inclusivity, and hegemonic state of the current public spheres became so evident to the scholars right after the publications of Habermas's works in English. Also, a whole range of works has appeared that stated the mediatized status of public spheres. They said that actually media became the vessels, sort of the blood system of the public deliberation, and the main nodes of deliberation and public discussion were now media, which Habermas didn't take into account from the very beginning. So mediatized public spheres became even more distorted because media had their own interest in public deliberation, and media were also distorted mirrors of public deliberation. And sometimes they gave voices not to everyone because they just couldn't do it due to their limited capacity of pronouncing all the viewpoints. They only chose major viewpoints, despite all the efforts of the EU, for example, or of national governments to ensure plurality in public deliberation. This rarely happened in real life. Also, we have seen, due to all these factors, due to appearance of counterspheres, of mediatization, and of irrationality, non-inclusivity, reproduction of, for example, ethnic structures in mediatized public spheres of the 90s, of the beginning of years 2000, before social networks appeared online. We have seen that there has been a lot of critique, and the public spheres already seemed to be quite disrupted, quite non-unitary, and quite imbalanced and conflictual. However, the very notion of the rational deliberative discussion as an ideal, as a goal, was not that much challenged. People only said that, yes, it was the ideal. Yes, we need to move there. We need to be rational, we need to be deliberative, we need to be inclusive. However, sometimes we cannot reach it. It doesn't mean we shouldn't reach it, we shouldn't try. However, after the advent of transnational social networking and social networking online as a special practice of public communication and interpersonal communication of today, gradually it has become clear that people do not deliberate in their real life and online as well. So deliberation as a practice for an individual is something that people do not come to do. Over 10 years ago, Yardi and Dana Boyd, the leading data scientists from Microsoft, have written a paper and posed a question. Do people come online to agree or to argue? So people either come online, they thought, either come online or either came online to find someone who would agree with them, to support their opinions, so to say, to find more selective exposure to similar opinions, to find confirmation. And there was this confirmation bias theory, which still works quite well for assessment of how people selectively search for and find information online. Or maybe people come online to argue, to find different viewpoints when they feel that, you know, their viewpoint has some weakness, or maybe they just want to vent their anger, vent their negative emotions, to go online to argue and then live calmly in their families. So the focus posing this question has led to reshifting the focus from arenas as places and their affordances for a while, you know, to publics, to how people behave online, to how people speak to each other, to the patterns of behavior, to the patterns of dialogue, polylogue, to the patterns of deliberation, if it exists. So arenas and publics have become two big sort of, you know, two big pillars to look at in terms of online communication. However, this question, whether people come to agree or to argue, has gradually, at least partly, lost its relevance. Because as we will see later on, people do not come online to agree or to argue at all, neither to agree nor to argue. They have different motivations. They have very different motivations that are different from this idea of finding a similar or an oppositional opinion. Also, digital threats, users' irrationality, and other negative features of public communication online have shown that the idea of earnest internet, the internet where people would deliberate, where people would discuss, you know, in an ideal way, that it will be a better place than our own world, you know, the world of offline. Will so online it will be much better because people will be equal, because people will be involved, because people will be rational, people will try to be their best, you know, to be their best versions, so to say. This didn't work. This was especially evident, this became especially evident after 2016, when the Snowden revelations came on, and also the Russian intermingling with the American elections played a huge role in this. So both Americans and Russians, for example, have shown that for them, the idea of earnest internet has failed and was even not taken into consideration. So people all felt they were helpless and at least partly hopeless about how internet would create a better world, so to say, create at least better deliberation, better practices of deliberation. So, of course, this has been sort of a trauma for people who think about internet, who think about public deliberation. So in 2018, the leading German communication scholar of today, Barbara Fetsch from Freie Uni Berlin, has written a paper about dissonant public spheres. Of course, she was writing it as a sort of critique of today's public spheres, of how dissonant they are, how many voices that do not sort of, you know, do not agree with each other and do not even aim to agree with each other. They just pronounce what they want. And this cacophony, this dissonance, was of course seen by a German scholar who really likes normativity as something demanding regulation or demanding change or demanding coming back to this idea of sort of, you know, dissonance, to assonance, to something that we could control, or at least something like, you know, at least see the borders of. However, my position is that we need to embrace the dissonance and realize that we live in this reality. People do not seek consensus when they come online. They have different motivations, and we do not need to deprive people who come to deliberate, to discuss, or just to speak, just to express themselves online, of their natural features. And we need to know how to live in this reality, and we need to know how to assess it. So we need a different normativity for a new state of deliberation that we see today. I would like to point out now to some concepts that were actually there even much before than this critique by Barbara Fetch appeared. We did have in our theory alternative visions of how public decision making goes and how people decide and how people choose, for example, politicians at elections. There's no sort of round by round deliberation online, as it is no public deliberation, round by round public deliberation offline among people. What other concepts have been there are the following. For example, the one of the spiral of silence, which you probably all know very well. Elisabeth Noel-Neumann, another German scholar who has studied election process in Germany in the late 60s to 70s, and then she started to write very interesting papers and books about how people choose, how people form the public opinion, how people choose politicians, and how this public opinion, who needs to be the leader, forms. What she has found is that under a pressure of majority, the minority starts gradually starts to silence itself. And the majority grows and grows and grows. And this goes in a spiral way, so to say. So even if at the beginning, there were two more or less similar groups of people who would choose one or another candidate, at the end, the spiral of silence will lead to the victory of just one, because some group will feel sort of, disprivileged, diminished. And if you get, for example, into a group of people, into a group of 10, where 8 people prefer one candidate and 2 prefer the other, the 2 would prefer to silence themselves, not to be excluded. This fear of exclusion of a society, of sort of unanimous society based on public opinion, unanimous group of people based on the public opinion, this fear of exclusion plays a huge role in how public opinion accumulates. Another version of this theory is a silent majority theory, because the silent majority theory is sort of a reversal spiral of silence, a reverse spiral of silence, because there a minority becomes very active and the silent passive majority leads an active minority not to decide itself, So there are different spirals, so to say, that gradually form inside a society, inside a community. Online, it might lead to formation of echo chambers or filter bubbles, of which you all also know really well. Echo chambers or filter bubbles inside public discussions means that there are some areas or spaces within discussions where a unanimous opinion dominates, so to say. And people there are not grouped by rationality. They're grouped by interest, by their political positioning, by emotion, by experience, or by even language. Also, later on, some scholars have shown that affect and situational dynamics play a huge role in how such echo chambers appear online, how this forms gradually, how these echo chambers gradually form online, due, for example, to affect, to some fear, to some shock. Such quasi-communities are unstable, they dissipate, they quite quickly gather, and then they quite quickly dissipate. So this cumulative character of finding your group or finding dynamics in this process, this cumulative character has started to show in academic works. There are also works about connective and contributive action, one by Bennett and Segerberg of 2012, and one by myself about contributive action, about how people first come together in some decision-making online and agree, for example, to go to a protest. And then there is a spillover effect. which leads to an offline protest rally, for example. So there's first a connection and then action. Or when people cannot move offline, they prefer to contribute to some online space, for example, via a flash mob, a petition, or something like that. And what matters is the gradually growing number of people who participate and their repeating action. For example, signing a petition. And when a petition reaches a certain threshold, the number of people who signed it reaches a certain threshold, it becomes important. So there are cumulative effects in how people try to pursue a decision, to push a decision online, for example. Also, there has been a great metaphor that I have found in a book by Christian Fuchs from the UK, from University of Westminster, who has written about Twitter as about a crowd crying to the skies, not talking to each other, but a huge crowd just shouting, just expressing itself. You know, when each person just expresses him or herself without trying to talk to each other pretty much. What unites all these individual contributions to political communication science is the idea of accumulation, is the sort of an umbrella idea of public opinion being cumulative by character online. It's not round by round deliberative opinion making, but cumulative opinion making. I can just show you a couple of examples from my own work. These are the Moscow street protests and their discussion on YouTube, just one video which had over 150,000 posts under, comments under it. And this is how they showed in time, you know. And people appeared online as commenters under this video. And we see that there's no discussion. It's just people who show up, say something, and they do not discuss it. With the red circles, red ovals, you see how people come online and they do not talk to anyone. They just continue expressing themselves. But with the blue circles, you see rare spaces where people did talk to each other. Several people talked to each other. So you see that actually the percentage of those who didn't talk to anyone, but just came and expressed anger or support to the author of the video, etc., is much, much higher than people who come, than the number of those who came to discuss something. You see how this is the graph of the discussion on the Ferguson riots in 2014, which we assessed, and you see how cumulative groups appear there gradually. You also see how aggression matters, for example, for discussion of on the case of Cologne mass harassment in the New Year Eve in Cologne, Germany. So the more aggression was there in the talk, the more people tended to discuss. So it was not deliberative. It was expressing the anger, which actually fueled the discussion. And we measured it and so on. Echo chambers that form based on compassion versus condemnation, based on emotions. In the case of Charlie Hebdo massacre in 2015 in Paris. So we have seen the echo chambers based first on language, and then on pure emotions, on compassion versus condemnation. So you see here that these processes are not that, you know, deliberative, round by round. They are non-inclusive. It's for those who want to participate. Yes, you can participate in a hashtag discussion, but it's not that it has a round table manner, but it has a cumulative manner. And this accumulation of opinion comes so quickly with millions of tweets within days. So we have suggested the concept of cumulative deliberation as an alternative view of how public opinion forms online. Aggregation of support, aggregation of hatred may be understood via a metaphor of tug of war. You know, when, for example, two groups of people have a thread and they go back and forth and someone wins. Those who is sort of, who has more power, those who has more force. So winning by accumulation, because there are spiral of silence effects, because there are echo chambering effects, and actually winning comes stochastically by accumulating more and more evidence, or more and more evidence of a particular opinion, for example. In such conditions, fragmentation of publics is a natural feature. Naturally, the clusters form, and seeing them as sort of a sign of wrong deliberation, normatively wrong deliberation, should be rethought, I think, because it's quite natural. Such a view on the cumulative character of public deliberation actually links us to something that has not yet been very much explored in terms of assessment of public communication online. The general systems theory, which actually might provide instruments to assess how quickly accumulation appears. Where are the thresholds where one opinion wins? And we need to find the bifurcation points in discussion, where exactly we can sort of, you know, choose the opportunity, choose between different options to which we conclude, to which we come as conclusions. So we might have much better instruments of explaining and predicting how real world discussions actually work. What is also important, and I think this is much more even, you know, much more important than just finding instruments for predicting discussions, is that we will avoid excessive and unnecessary normativity, because we cannot impose normativity that we had imposed to institutions, to institutional discourses, to individual people who come online to express themselves, who have their fears, who have their motivations, who have their expectations, who have their experience, emotions, age, and so on. You know, we need to be sort of, you know, I would say human oriented. We need to look at how people really deliberate and give them their right to deliberate. Give them their right to deliberate the way they do. Even if we see some aggression, even if we see bots and trolls and so on, because it happens, we need to realize that this is the reality. Of course, we need to educate people. We need to educate our children how to behave online. There should be netiquette in discussions. However, we need to take into consideration that freedom of speech implies that people have not only rationality, but also emotionality, interests, fears, and expectations. Also, cumulative deliberation allows for taking into account each particular tiny act of communication. People from Oxford have written a couple of years a book where they coined this term, tiny acts of political participation, something like one like, one comment, one repost. This matters. It's not slacktivism as it used to be named. You know, people who are just so for critics, so for politicians who know how to do it, but never do anything. They just like, they just comment. However, we need to realize that each like matters, because this is a tiny expression of support or a dislike, for example, an expression of non-support, we would say. So we need to take this into account because it accumulates into on a much bigger scale than just one like. When we look at the cumulative level of these effects, we will realize that each particular participation, each particular communicative action, as Habermas would say, each tiny communicative action matters. And I think this also comes back to a personality, to a person online, rather than we would impose institutional demands to individual communication. So we have sort of an agenda for discussion. We need to know what lies inside online discussions that allows for cumulation. Because cumulative mechanisms are on one hand mathematical. There is a paper by Conover and colleagues of 2011, of 10 years ago. In this paper, the scholars have shown, in their many papers actually, they have shown that as soon as there are two groups of people, one has one opinion, the other has another opinion, an opposing opinion. As soon as they start to discuss something, and they are mixed, for example, so we come on Twitter and we know that there are two opinions, but they are all mixed. As soon as they start talking, the process starts that leads to formation of two groups. So inevitably, people will form echo chambers, at least to some extent. So people will form echo chambers mathematically. The probability of co-minded people starting to talk together is much higher than the opposite probability of not forming echo chambers. So this is a natural process. However, we need to know what spurs this process and what slows this process. Is it emotion? Is it experience? Is it aggression? Certain type of speech? I would say we need to find new, sort of closer to reality grounds for social solidarity, and we need to look at how this solidarity forms. Because what we have seen in the YouTube discussion of which I have told you, on YouTube discussion of 2019 in Moscow, what we have written about was solidarity in condemnation, solidarity in non-liking the current Russian authorities, because it was oppositional YouTube. And this was absolutely a pattern that appeared there, and it was based on both disliking, on emotion, and at some point on aggression. However, this was a huge foundation for solidarity, for negative solidarity. We need to take this into account. We need to see how it forms, what can be done in terms of sort of making it more peaceful, what can be done in terms of finding bridges between such areas, of organizing and reorganizing online communication and providing spaces where different opinions could form and different opinions could talk to. And what would be the role of media in this? Because media are quite weak in terms of online presence now, because there are different influencers rather than media. What we have discussed, what we have detected is that media usually stand around the center of discussion, between the center and periphery, because they provide information both for the center and for the periphery of the discussions. So what media could do about it, what media could do about this natural patterns of discussions that form online, what factors can help us predict discussion outcomes? How can we find the early versions, that sort of at the early stages, how do we predict whether this discussion will be very much biased, very much one-sided, or there will be two different sides, for example, and two different echo chambers will form? What would be better in this occasion, to form several echo chambers, or several, for example, partly penetrating echo chambers, to continue to talk, for people to continue to talk to each other across echo chambers, or forming a dominant echo chamber that would comprise more people that would be unanimous. However, there will be tiny counterspheres around that will be not part of this big consensus. What markers help delineate substantial discussions on particular decisions from today's trash on Twitter, for example, from discussing on cats, popular music, boys and girls relations, and so on. So how do we detect when and where the discussions become relevant for public decision making? How do we find those markers, and how do we find the patterns in such discussions? How do they differ from the rest of the internet and the rest of the social networking discussion? How do we calculate and predict critical points in how discussion develop? Can we do it via automated means, for example, the way that my colleagues and I do? How do we predict the discussion, the development of discussion in terms of topicality, in terms of sentiment, in terms of aggression? How do we predict and thus somehow balance them by other means? Shall we do that or not is another question. Do we need to regulate discussion online, and how exactly do we need to regulate it? Because, for example, the Russian evidence is that harsh words online actually are markers for people of sort of, of strangers. There's special lexicons for anti-oppositional and anti-state people, for example. So such lexicons, if they're banned, for example, from online by law, will make people create other means of recognizing your co-thinker. So how do we regulate? How do we predict critical points in discussion? How do we predict spillovers? Do we need to predict them, and do we need to regulate them? And how do we measure the democratic efficiency of such discussions? Because a lot of them are just discussions that have no impact offline. However, some of them do have impact offline. So how do we actually develop the indicators of quality of such cumulative deliberation? And I suggest employing general systems theory, computational methods, and many more different instruments to assess this cumulative patterns of deliberation. This is what my lab is doing, and we are publishing papers on the cumulative patterns of discussion. And what I also wanted to underline, and that will be the last point in my presentation for today, is that the contextual factors in how people deliberate also matter really much, because contextual features and like the current history around the discussion, for example, affect very much how exactly these cumulative patterns work. And also representational aspects of who is on a platform, for example, which groups are on a platform. Out of it, all the cumulative patterns might be deduced, nearly all, as we see now. So employing these mechanisms, computational methods, and combining them with knowledge of history, with knowledge of today's representation, social representation, knowledge of political polarization, will allow us predict how aggressive or how one-sided such discussions might be, and probably sort of, do something as NGOs might intervene in such discussions, and politicians might take this into consideration and also strategically intervene for balancing the interests of different public groups within the society that doesn't want an internal war, that wants to be more balanced in terms and more peaceful inside itself. So I think this was all for my presentation for today. Sorry if I was shorter than you expected, but I see that there are comments and probably questions in the chat. So I would like to save some time for answering those.
Thank you so much for Madam for your enlightening session. Now I'd like to request Professor B.C. Das for go for a quick comment, please, sir.
Yeah, namaskar to madam, and we are
Shall I address them or?
yeah.
Okay, so I will read aloud the questions and then I'll go for them. So the first question was, how do you look at the spectator politics in liberal democracy due to the shrinking public sphere when we see the increasing control over media by state and corporate houses? Well, this is a good question. This also relates to this, previous step in the development of public spheres, which Habermas calls refeudalization. And the spectator politics, yes, the society of the spectacle, as Guy Debord said, has a lot to do with how political decision-making is done today. Of course, this has been highly criticized all around the world. And what we have seen today, that expectations from internet, from how internet would change the situation, have developed in a sinusoid way. First, people had a lot of hopes. We were very optimistic of how internet would influence the society of the spectacle and would sort of bring the truth into the public sphere. Then there was a whole period of disillusionment. There were books like and works like The Web That Failed, for example, by Floriana Fossato and John Lloyd from Oxford, UK, who wrote about Russia, that actually democratization of politics didn't come with internet. Nothing changed, so to say, or even became worse. Now, today, after a big jump and a big dive, we come to a more balanced understanding of how internet might impact sort of today's situations, both in autocracies and in democracies. In capitalist democracies, we would say, online public deliberation and online big online discussion actually do matter for agenda setting, first of all, because if it comes to social networks, then media capture these agendas pretty much. So we see more and more correlation between online agendas and media agendas, despite, of course, for the media, this is quite hard to adopt such agendas and to adapt to existing of such agendas. This has been quite a difficult process for a lot of media in Germany, in France, in the UK, in America. However, public agendas have carved its place gradually inside today mediatized public agendas and public agendas of big media. The form of it is still sort of the form of scandals mostly. As soon as online something like a scandal starts, it is easier captured by mainstream media. However, the impact of this, popular discussion online is much bigger than before social networks existed. So I think still publics have a chance to influence the deliberative process, which is still highly institutionalized and refeudalized, as Habermas would say. Because what I'm suggesting is just a framework of how we think about what people do online, right? And one of the questions that I have posed in my recent paper on cumulative deliberation is how exactly online discussions may influence decision-making offline. And your question is quite legitimate because we haven't yet even studied how it matters and why it would matter for politicians who have full right to decide for themselves, because they're elected or because they have captured the power. and they have unlimited power, so to say, to decide because they have been entitled to, while people online have not. And this is a very good question. However, it reminds me of a situation of the 18th century in London, when the first journalists started to make an impact inside the House of Lords in London, in the British Parliament. No one also expected them to become an influential power. However, they did. They have become an influential power. So I think online discussions are already there to look at, and media in the Western democracies do look at it. In autocracies like Russia, which might be considered an autocracy, a semi-autocracy, or a full autocracy, depending on measurement, or in China, the situation is a bit different. However, in China, there is a lot of evidence that online discussions have a lot of impact on a regional level, on small level, on the local level. It doesn't have impact upon the national policy making. However, due to very sort of, to the role that local civil servants play, they might be replaced, they might be jailed, and so on, if there's sort of no agreement with them in the local community, on them with the local communities, if people disagree to have such civil servants. Of course, the situation is more complicated than I'm trying to pronounce. In Russia, I would say online discussions so far have had very weak impact upon public decision making. However, what we see, we do have evidence, for example, that individual complaints directly to authorities, to their channels on Instagram, for example, to their accounts on Instagram, play today a bigger role than when local media pronounce this or that problem. So finding direct ways of communicating with local authorities is one thing. Then a second thing is that internet in Russia, especially social media, has been unregulated, relatively unregulated, at least till 2017. And it has become a place of free discussion, of free speech, unlike mainstream media, especially the federal channels of TV. So here, internet has been playing a role of a free arena. Of course, after 2016, 2017, the legal situation has changed, and today it's much more dangerous to say many things online. However, the flavor, the atmosphere that still exists there is vital for people who want to pronounce their political position. And we have seen several cases of public solidarity around oppositional journalists, for example, around Ivan Golunov, who was jailed based on false accusations, but then released when a lot of people, when there was a spillover of online discussion into offline action. So the spillover cases are something that matter, something that matters, and both in autocracies and in democracies. Then how culture industries led to refeudalization of public sphere, limiting our free choices due to increasing powerful position of economic corporations. Yeah, I think this is a very similar question, because yes, interestingly, the cultural industries or creative industries who have been entitled to provide us more free discussion and free situation have become a limiting factor due to their market positions, market leadership, for example, of economic media corporations, including them. And interestingly, that, for example, the European Union has invested a lot of money into artificially supporting local newspapers, for example, or creating very different regulation for media corporations in comparison with other economic corporations. For example, the cartel law in Germany allows for M&A deals, like merger and acquisition deals of 250 million, up to 250 million euro. However, for media, it's 10 times smaller. So you cannot unite two media enterprises if the overall sum comes over 25 million euro. So this is something that the EU has tried to do in terms of supporting their media pluralism. However, of course, this was not enough. What we have seen in social networks, as I said, a potential of agenda setting, potential of agenda influence. Also, I would say what we see online is contextualization, because media are our interpreters of agenda, not only agenda hierarchy forms in the media content, but also interpretations and framing. However, when user comments appeared and social networks appeared, what we have there is the social context and social understanding of how we see news and how we see events. And I think this becomes more and more important. And this is not coincidental that in most autocracies like Azerbaijan, for example, comment sections for state news and state media are closed for people not to discuss. So discussing news online, for example, actually matters for how these news are chosen, how these news are shaped, and how these news are contextualized. A good question. Public decision is not taken often by sensing public opinion, rather highly influenced by the state bureaucrats or commissioners. What's your idea about the dictatorship of bureaucrats over democratic citizens, intellectuals and thought leaders, which is rational public opinion or the imposed decision of bureaucrats? Of course, bureaucracy is there. I am not saying that we will come with our decisions instead of bureaucrats, that online public communication will be instead, or will become a second power or substitute bureaucrats. Of course, yes, policymakers, including parliaments and governments, will be there to govern and will be there to take decisions. However, as I just said 5 minutes before, we need to know, we need to study how public opinion that forms online differently than we thought, how it has chances to influence, to change decision making. We need to know whether civil servants take this into account. We still have quite scarce evidence in different countries on how this matters and how the different patterns of accumulation of opinion lead or do not lead to changes in public deliberation on the strategic level, on institutional level. So this linkage is crucial, and this is still missing in our academic science, in academic studies. And I think this is a huge area of research that we need to explore. And this is equally important for democracies and autocracies. What is your suggestion to widen the public sphere by making it more participatory and deliberative, when the private sphere or the private interest of the public is also increasingly dominated as well as controlled by media-driven democracy and consumer-driven capitalism? This, replicates the questions that are, they are important for all of us. My suggestion would be that in order to increase the impact of online discussions, open mechanisms should be open. So, because in autocracies, for example, like where I live, I know that whatever is said online or whatever people discuss online or whatever people form as initiatives online might not work, because people are just, people have no power. So empowerment that might come from online deliberation is another big issue to research. Empowerment studies have been around, empowerment and online empowerment have been there for quite a long time already, but mostly they were focusing on communities deprived of voice due to ethnic, religious, or other social means. However, no less important is political diminishment of your voice, you know, and in countries like Russia, sometimes there are no other reasons of diminished people because we don't have a lot of ethnic hatred, we don't have a lot of religious hatred, but we do have quite a diminished position of people who are not supporting the current regime. So capturing the public sphere by strategic players, as Habermas would say, by capitalist powers for democracies and autocratic powers in autocracies, is a problem that I cannot resolve myself, you know, today. However, creating linkages, creating channels for assessment of public deliberation, instruments of assessment of public opinion online needs to be there. So the power needs to look at it, not to regulate it too much, but probably to take it into consideration. Also, for this is, you know, this is a double-edged sword, because what is said online can be studied. Studying it means you can do something good for people after studying what they think. However, you can also rule people, so to say, into the side that you like, you know, into something that like marketing companies, for example, do, like market research does. They create artificial needs, for example, that then they fulfill quite successfully, and they can rule us to this or that direction, so to say. They can lead us to this or that direction by doing so. So we need more transparency and accountability in how market research is done and in which interest, in whose interest it is done. There needs to be more practical accountability procedures that might be implemented by the demand of people. And politically, accountability means connection between your politicians and yourselves, and my politicians and myself. Getting to know people, online communication facilitates this communication. So I think the local level and the communal level and the level of just one individual politician might work. Because in Russia, this is something that actually lacks, and what we lack from in the system, because our representatives of people do not work with people. And this is a huge problem. It really differs from how it works in the UK, despite UK has its own problems, you know. I would like to see more mechanisms, online mechanisms established that would ensure for transparency and accountability, so that we see what this or that particular politician is about, and we could comment on that, and we could complain, and we could say how we can help, and so on and so forth. So this should be more involving than this strategic communication, so to say, by different big powers. This should be more involving on the local level. This should be more involving on community level. This should be more involving on the NGO level. And these mechanisms might be very precise in terms of deciding on local issues, in terms of bringing local issues more on a regional level, we would say, than on the national level. So I am pro developing this from the grassroots level and demanding that you politicians are actually accountable. And online means for that are much more, have much more power than we can realize, actually, if we don't use such mechanisms. how do you consider the importance of the public sphere for the disadvantaged, marginalized, and downtrodden sections of our society who have very little bargaining power, right, in the decision-making process, so far as the participatory liberal democracy is concerned? What I have just said about cumulative deliberation, unfortunately, can be even worse. We need to realize that can be even worse for such diminished communities and disadvantaged communities, deprived of voice even before. What we have seen online is something that might be called normalization. As soon as a new platform appears, there's a lot of, there's a chaos, we would say. There is a rush to a new platform, and new hierarchies form, and new ways of using this platform forms. However, time passes, and shorter time for each new platform passes, and we see how the platform gets normalized. It means that there are optimal ways of using it that form, and also the hierarchies that existed on previous platforms and in the offline life actually reappear on a particular platform. Moreover, the platform affordances can enhance the gaps between different communities. If one community is stronger on a platform, it will be more and more strong, it will be stronger and stronger. Unfortunately, there are sort of no mechanisms so far that could provide for more equality in terms of communities online. There are works that show that online deliberation actually provides for better voice, for bigger voice for such disadvantaged communities, LGBTQ, for example, or immigrant communities, when they are united from within, when they are united offline. However, when they are scattered around and they are not united offline, they are not working as diasporas, as digital diasporas, they just exist. It means that they might be even more disadvantaged, unfortunately. So for social networks, or for the internet on the whole, to work for them, this needs a conscious effort, unfortunately, because automatically internet does not provide, social networking does not provide for better voice. Unfortunately, this needs as much effort as it needs offline, unfortunately. This is my position because I'm seeing how it happens, how it has been happening with the immigrant communities that I've been researching upon here in Russia, for example. And I see that as soon as they're not doing anything, consciously about giving voice to themselves, about getting voice, nothing will happen. No one will provide them their voice online, unfortunately. So we need to know that platforms are just instruments, and they might be hammers. You can kill by a hammer, or you can construct a house by a hammer. This is just an instrument that people might use for much better sort of getting voice than before. However, this doesn't come automatically. Does the new media coverage increase the objectivity of the media and information provided to the public? Does the new media? I would say more yes than no. However, again, there is a double-edged sword, because with the growth of online communication, we all know how fake news and how fake and false information and, for example, trolls information, computational propaganda has been on the rise. However, I truly believe in this, beehive way of finding the truth. Because earlier, we depended on journalists to deduce the truth from the reality, to find the truth that would not be controversial, and to create a picture for us that would be non-controversial and would explain and would have some explanatory power, I would say. However, now, as soon as the news is placed online, there will be a beehive of commenting that would sort of contextualize, as I said, this piece of news, which will say, no, you're wrong here, and maybe you misinterpreted something here, so let's think this and this and this. It will be probably there will be a controversial picture, but it will be not, if there is a mistake. A lot of people actually deduce mistakes in journalistic reporting today and provide for clarifications and provide for more information, which is evidence-based, which is witness-based, and which might correct mistakes. So this is a double-edged sword, I would say. It's much more, we don't need to forget about fake news and about our disability sometimes to withstand fake news or to oppose the fake news and deduce them from the media flow. However, I think that this beehive way of finding the truth also matters a lot. At least it matters at least as much as the growth of fake news. There is also one question: what do you think about social networking like innovation way to solve e-democracy gap? Again, as I said, this is just an instrument, and social networking, of course, might be a way to solve e-democracy gaps, like, for example, digital divide gaps of various kinds. However, I think that these gaps are also sort of natural, but they were characteristic of a special period of time. For example, the generational divide will not be that big because the more people are born within the realm of internet, so to say, within this reality of internet, the smaller this gap will be with generations, you know, with generations dying out and appearing. Some other gaps, though, might appear, because as soon as one gap closes, another gap appears. And this is this dialectics of how we assess public communication online. As soon as one conflict is resolved, another conflict re-emerges or emerges and becomes on the agenda, becomes important on the agenda. So I would say that digital divide, there's more evidence that it will be diminished than it will be growing, I think. However, it will depend on whether some extreme new technologies appear, like chips for, you know, implementing into human body or whatever. So as soon as this technology that we know becomes sort of non-divisive to a certain extent, I'm afraid there will be more technologies and more innovations that will create new gaps, because any technology creates such gaps inevitably. This is our conscious effort that is there to stop these gaps, not from appearing, but from growing, I would say. I think these are all the questions that we had. And sorry, I was long.
Thank you, madam.
Thank you so much, madam. Madam, your time permits, I would ask one small question to you, madam.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Madam, what is your suggestions and observations about the Gramsci's hegemonic approach related to the public sphere as concerned and the propaganda machinery in 1940s? What he told about the new Marxist theory, public propaganda always in terms of the side of regime. Then you rightly mentioned about the public sphere of the Habermas. Habermas always wrote about the European model, not consciously perceives the ideas about the Indian model. What happened in India? If you look seriously about the news channels and the media propaganda of India, these people, you know, media house always propaganda and related to these promotion and publicity events of glamorized world. I have two examples. One, the Miss World Aishwarya Rai's marriage covered 3 days the entire national media's fraternity, and then again Miss World Priyanka Chopra's marriage covered all over the world, even not taking seriously the what happened ground reality in terms of this Habermas theory, you rightly mentioned content and community, which is important. The content is very more important for this Indian media, and these communities is very less, because communities is not the selling and packaging ideas of in terms of Habermas theory. And lastly, the Chomsky theory, if you look seriously upon the Chomsky theory, what is your suggestion and what is your observation in terms of Russian media and German media? What you look upon seriously and seriously doing research on about it? How the third world countries, supported by the UNESCO's ideas and the propaganda machinery, they impose their ideas on us in every time. And the first world countries, they have taken the liberty in terms of everything. And we are suffering a lot due to lack of embracing nature of this psychological or propaganda machinery in terms of this world order, like WHO and this ADP, this IMF and this WTO. These agencies, these multinational agencies, always try to track our consumers as first and these products as second. They wanted to demoralize the idea, psychological phenomena to the audience and consumers both as well in terms of the 21st century globe. What is your suggestions, madam?
I'm sorry, I could hear you quite bad, so I'll try to deduce what you said. I'm sorry for that. So the connection was a bit poor. As to your first example, right, that people might not be even able to deliberate in Habermasian terms, and what they want is more entertaining content, and they might be speaking on a very different sort of, with different notions and different with different words, right? So it was absolutely clear that this is something that I also am very much concerned about, and this is why I am trying to get sort of back a person, how he or she is there, back into communication and back to understanding of how we need to assess this, because we cannot say that, oh, your communication is just bad. We should not be saying this. We need to realize that there might be an old lady somewhere in Chelyabinsk and a 15-year-old somewhere in St. Petersburg. There might be people in rural communities in India, or might be people somewhere in New York, and they have very full right to be themselves in online communication. And I think sort of posing these demands to them is unfair and unjust. However, of course, they will never have a similar deliberative power to those strategic big actors of communication. And this is a big problem, because the more we see online communication, the more we see that it gets normalized again, and these big strategic powers take the power back. I'm not sure how I can answer your second question, because I did really hear it very bad, because you were speaking about the WHO and other entities, I think, right? Was that right? Can you repeat it shortly?
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, madam, I talked about the WHO, WTO, IMF, and World Bank. These global agencies, in terms of multinational agencies, how these, track these ideas upon us to sell their ideas in terms of consumer and audience.
Mm-hmm. This, I would say, this is another very big problem. What I'm seeing now from assessing the anti-vaccine communities, anti-vax communities in Russia, for example, I'm doing this work right now. Like, I will stop speaking here and will continue my work upon such communities. What I can say is that, unfortunately, global players do not have, they don't have trust, just like local politicians, just like national politicians.
Right.
So to convey the message, they need to have trust. And there is a problem of sort of democratic deficit and trust deficit, because they're very high and people in the communities are sort of on a very different level. And this is not only the problem of language, they speak in a very different language, they just don't understand each other. But also this is a problem of, I would say, traditional, this, gap between rich and poor, so to say, because these organizations are seen as organizations that come from the West, come from richer part of the world, so to say. So richer part of the world has very rarely been kind to other parts of the world, we would say, right? So how do we build trust indeed on the very local level and individual level? Probably, you know, by informing people on how these organizations work. This is an illusion. Informing is nothing. But I think that here, traditional media should do their work properly. Here, I would rely, this is an ideal situation. However, there's no one to rely upon, you know, in building trust between communities and large organizations who would try to convey their message, which might probably be good, like if you speak about the coronavirus, for example, right? What we could do is that media, for example, we just had infodemics. We've just had the infodemics, and this infodemics had a very peculiar nature, because media tried to provide more and more information for people, a bit abusing the situation because they had more money from more views online and so on, but they did not contextualize what was going on. We were lacking proper context, because a lot of scattered news doesn't mean we have a reference field. Creating more reference field, like, you know, like the feeling of that we know where to go for information, also means working with the fears of people much better, much better. Asking people what you're concerned about, what would be your big troubles now, you know, and addressing this together with what international organizations say, and putting their words in the context of fear, not in the context of policing, for example, and the discourses on policing, but also in the context of people's speech, people's talk. I think this is something that media didn't do in many countries. They got into this trap of traditional genres, of traditional news, inverted pyramid styles, and so on and so forth, without really going to people, without really going and asking, what are you afraid of? Are you afraid of a vaccine, or are you afraid of the disease more? They did not do properly this job, because I think this might be one little brick, one small brick in building more trust. Because for example, for the Russian context, WHO practically did not exist before. We just didn't know what, except for the classification of diseases. We didn't know, we didn't want it, we didn't need it before. Why would we trust something that we don't know? So informing, but informing without putting their message into proper context doesn't work. So contextualization would be one little step, you know, towards building trust, and then trust would build conveying good message, conveying the message, and sort of people following their message, I think, because this is something that I can think of. However, I am much more pessimistic than optimistic in this respect.
Thank you so much, madam. It's a very wonderful and very profoundly you said about all this truth behind all in terms of this world order and disorder. Thank you so much, madam. And this is a formal invitation. We knew who come to India must visit to our university, that is called Ravensa University, and we immediately collaborating with your university so possible, as our vice chancellor is very much interested to do a collaborate with your university. Now with this note, I would like to invite Professor Bikral Das to go for a quick comment and also a formal vote of thanks. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I would be delighted to continue working together. Thank you so much, and thank you for your questions. They were really good. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Madam,
Bye-bye.
for your
Bye.
delivery.
Madam, need your 2 minutes for your formal vote of thanks and quick comments on your talk.
Okay. Extend my heartfelt thanks to Madam,
Yes.
Honorable Speaker, for this excellent deliberation. I would, on behalf of CAD and collaborating institutions like Ravenshaw University, IIM Sambalpur, and Central University of Odisha, I am thankful to our partners, Honorable Vice Chancellors of these three universities, and my colleagues, my dear organizers, and the Director, Center for Adivasi Research and Development. Thank you very much, Madam. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. It was very delightful. Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Madam, and looking for future engagement also.
Yeah, indeed.
And
Thank you so much.
Namaste from India, Madam. Namaste.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.